Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. We're joined by Charlie Gammell, who is a former Foreign Office diplomat and author of books on the Middle East. And we are here to look at the big question: what does Israel hope to achieve in the broader Middle East? And I think the question we're going to start off with, Charlie, straight away is: what has happened to Hezbollah? The amazing achievement that the IDF has performed against Hezbollah seems to have set it on the back foot. Can you just give us a summary of what has happened to it, and what do you think Israel is trying to achieve?
So, first of all, Nicholas, lovely to be here again and good to see you. And I'm delighted to be on this webinar. I think we have to sort of take ourselves back to October the 8th and remind ourselves that since October the 8th, the day after the Hamas massacre in Israel, Hezbollah have been firing rockets from southern Lebanon into Israel since that time. So about a year now that these rockets have been daily exchange or relatively daily exchange of rockets between Israel and Hezbollah. So that's the scene set for this issue, and I think over the course of the conflict in Gaza, what you've been seeing from Netanyahu's cabinet is people gradually starting to talk about Hezbollah as the big threat in the north. I mean, obviously Israel is aware that's always been the threat in the north, but a little bit like in 2001 after the US invaded Afghanistan, you gradually had people within the Bush administration talking about Saddam Hussein, even though Saddam Hussein wasn't necessarily behind the events of 9/11. So there are similarities there. And I think since October the 7th last year and now, you've had this increasing drumbeat of, well, actually the real enemy is Hezbollah, because if we go out one further, the real enemy is Iran, and Iran is behind to a degree both of these powers. So that's the longer term, shorter term backdrop to this. But I think what kicked this off, what changed the escalatory phase from where we were, let's say 3 weeks ago, to where we are now, was the attack by Israel, the pager attack by Mossad on Hezbollah fighters and those affiliated with Hezbollah. And I think the reason that's really important, I remember the advisory work that I was doing at the time, the way I was explaining it was that previously you had this tit for tat escalatory spiral in which Israel would take one commander off the battlefield and Hezbollah or Hamas would respond, or Iran would respond in its own way. And this was the same song being played louder and louder. I think the pager attack was a completely different song. And the reason is because that changed the game, because it was an attack that very, very clearly aimed to cripple Hezbollah's ability to operate. Killing a top-level commander doesn't really change a group's ability to conduct operations. It might hit morale, it might be problematic in the short term, but it doesn't hit your core ability to operate. So when this happened, I think a lot of people were thinking this is pursuant to a much bigger attack on Hezbollah, which is what we've seen.
And that was some. I mean, what really strikes me about that thing is that it would have been at least a year, 2 years in preparation. I don't think it would have. I mean, I'm thinking about the way they were set up and delivered. I'm just thinking of the timing of this. It's hard to conceive that that idea within a year. Maybe they did do it within a year from October the 7th, but it would seem to me that they did it before that. And that it was discovered. We know that it was that Hezbollah was actually beginning to pick up on this idea and was going to say, it was somebody had said, "Get rid of your pages," which indicates to me that Israel took this action earlier than it had hoped, but it had it up its sleeves as part of a broader attack.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that Mossad will be doing these types of operations, will be planning these types of operations at all times. And I think the planning for an operation like this, as you say, it would have taken a long time. A supply chain operation is fraught with the danger of people finding out and everything you're trying to do just going wrong. So it does take time, and there are lots of people who need to be in on the secret, as it were, which again creates lots of risks. So something like this would have been long time in the planning. And I think Mossad ideas like this floating around, and when the situation calls for it, they can use it. So I'm 100% certain that there'll be Mossad supply chain operations into the Iranian missile program, for example, and they can choose at what point they want to sort of dial that up or dial that down. But going back to your earlier question of where is Hezbollah now, I think it's undoubtedly clear that Hezbollah is weakened. Absolutely, it's been decimated at the top. And I think it does know, I think at the moment it's unclear as to which way is up for the people in Hezbollah. And I think this is what a lot of people have been asking, well, why haven't Hezbollah used their sort of vaunted missile arsenal? And I think part of that is because they are waiting to try and absorb some Israeli pressure to hold those missiles in reserve, because they think that they're in for a long campaign. And what they don't want to do is they don't want to loosen off a barrage of missiles, which then invites more Israeli attacks at a time when they are so fragile and febrile and dislocated as a group. So I think this is they're trying to hold, they're trying to buy some time, they're trying to regroup. I think in terms of supplying, Iran always has the route overland into Lebanon through which they can resupply Hezbollah. So in terms of munitions, that's not so much a problem, but manpower, morale, these are issues that Hezbollah are grappling with at the moment, which to my mind explains their relative passivity in the face of the Israeli bombardment.
Is there some kind of internal dispute within Hezbollah? I mean, who are Hezbollah's loyalties to? I mean, there's their own self-preservation at stake, and then there's loyalty to Iran.
Yeah, and I think you have to always situate Hezbollah within. I think we have to always situate Hezbollah within the Lebanese state, and Lebanon as a place where you have Sunnis, where you have Shias, where you have Christians. We are seeing in the north of Lebanon, to a degree, a sectarian backlash, or a backlash against Hezbollah, which is being couched in very sectarian terms. In the city of Tripoli, in the north of Lebanon, people were parading through the streets celebrating Nasrallah's death, and the same has seen in other parts of the Middle East. So there's always there's that tension that it could fragment along sectarian lines. So Hezbollah is loyal to itself. It got a lot of popularity in Lebanon after 2006 when it successfully pushed Israel back. But Lebanon is a very different country to the one in 2006. It's economically troubled, and it's potentially more divided. So Hezbollah has to play to its domestic constituent and has to be mindful. A lot of people in Lebanon don't want another war. At the same time, it is loyal to Iran. I think the really interesting tensions that are starting to emerge are those between Iran and Hezbollah. Khamenei, not long after or before Nasrallah was killed, said this is an issue for Lebanese Hezbollah. And effectively, he was distancing himself from Hezbollah, which is a relatively unthinkable thing to do. And you had some people within Hezbollah saying publicly and privately, I wonder if Khamenei was behind, or Iran had something to do with the killing of Nasrallah, which is obviously ridiculous. But I think that's indicative of the tensions that exist within these two groups, and a broader sense that amongst some of Iran's proxies, the Houthis, Hezbollah and Hamas in particular, that they're being hung out to dry in the face of Israeli bombardments.
That's absolutely fascinating. Now, why would I mean, previously, those groups have been very useful for Iran. They're not particularly strong when it compared to Israel militarily. Hezbollah is perhaps the slight exception to that, and they have been the arm of Iranian foreign policy. Why is Iran holding back at this stage? So has been so reluctant.
Yeah, and I think this is you have to understand that Iran, relative to other powers in the Middle East, doesn't spend very much GDP on its own conventional army. And that is because of, as we've heard lots over the last year, it outsources its security to this sort of web of proxies in the Middle East. And they are its forward defense, as people call it. But if they get destroyed, then they're sort of doubly vulnerable. I mean, it's like a sort of a door with a very strong padlock that's actually quite flimsy. And this is the fragility that Iran is grappling with now. Is how does it secure itself in the region if, for example, the Houthis are done, if, for example, Hezbollah is done. So the reason that Iran is distancing itself, the reason that Iran wants to de-escalate, is potentially because it's on the back foot. Now, having said that, there is an offensive reason to these proxies, and one of the reasons that these proxies have the offensive capacity of these proxies is that they can fight a sort of regional guerrilla conflict. So they can attack American bases. The Houthis can stop shipping through the Red Sea. So it's not just a defensive posture; it's also an offensive posture. But I wrote in an article recently that what is Iran like without its proxies, and Israel is trying to find that out. And I think that sustained bombardment of these proxies is something that Iran finds or sees as an existential threat to its regional security architecture. But at the same time, the reason America doesn't want a regional war, the reason Israel doesn't want a regional war, is because it knows that Iran has the capability to be a very, very effective and damaging spoiler to the region through these proxies. So they're both a strength and a weakness. And I think that's really important to draw out.
Absolutely. So at the moment, so let's just sort of recap that Hezbollah has been a deterrent for Iran, and that at the moment is being found out. And really, Iran looks weak from an Israeli perspective. What's the debate going on in Tehran?
Yeah, I think, and I've said this since the start of the conflict, that the big regional risk here is that one side, potentially Israel, and it was, and I did think Iran previously, but now it's Israel, that Israel underestimates the strength and the cohesion of Iran, of its enemy, and thinks slightly hubristically, now is the chance to redraw the map of the Middle East. Now we can make these gains that we've always dreamed of. As America did after the Taliban fell in 2001, they thought, right, now's the chance to redraw the map of the Middle East. We'll go after Saddam, we'll go after the Iranians, and we will have these sort of swift, decisive victories throughout these areas that trouble us. That I think is still a big risk. And from speaking to people who are very close to Netanyahu's war cabinet, the sense in Israel at the moment is now's the chance to get rid of Hezbollah. Now's the chance to get rid of Hamas. Now's the chance to push back against Iran. And in that's the context against which we should see Netanyahu speaking directly to the Iranian people, saying, my quarrel is not with you, my quarrel is with the Islamic Republic. And that was a very kind of sort of a neocon type message. It was like the sort of the thing that George Bush would have said in the mid 2000s when America was sort of ascendant before it all went wrong. You have one caucus in Iran, which is the hardliners who are aligned to the supreme leader. And it's important before we sort of set this out. I've always explained this, you have sort of two pillars within the Islamic Republic. One is the parliamentary elected, the sort of the parliamentary, the ministries, the president. That is its own little entity. And then you have the hardliners, which are the supreme leader, the Basij, and the IRGC. And on the moderates or the sort of non-hardliner side, you have the army as well. And obviously you can have hardliners in power like we have with Raisi. But what you have now is you have Pezeshkian, who can be termed as a moderate, and in the leadership debates in the lead up to the election, the presidential election in Iran recently, Pezeshkian was calling on a détente with the West. He was calling on Iranian behavior that would cause the West to ease sanctions, which would sort of de-escalate things and help Iran become better integrated into the sort of the region of nations. And I think what his caucus, people like Pezeshkian and Zarif, are arguing for is we have to de-escalate because we don't want to get dragged into a war. We can't get dragged into a war because that will cause domestic instability, and domestic instability now in Iran potentially could topple the regime. This is the line of thinking that sort of the Pezeshkian people are saying. And then you have the other side who are saying, we cannot let Israel hit us around like this. We have to, and this is the IRGC and this is Khamenei, we have to push back against Israel in a way that is calibrated enough so that we don't tip ourselves over into a regional war, but that we aren't that we uphold this idea of deterrence, that we stop Israel from doing the things that it's doing to us. And I think this sort of theory, if you want to call it something, is escalate to de-escalate. And again, I sometimes think of this: if you're outside a pub and you want to de-escalate, there's a fight and you want to de-escalate, the last thing you do is punch someone in the face as hard as you can, because that they're going to do the same to you. And I think that we just have, this is the flaw in that theory, because if Iran hits back hard, Israel's going to do the same. And if Israel hits Iran, Iran might. So the only way out of this is through some kind of mediated de-escalation, which is probably diplomatic. And that's where Pezeshkian thinks that things should go. But there are people within Iran who, like Netanyahu, these are the hardliners in Iran, they say, well, look, Israel is fighting war on a number of fronts. The world is turning against Israel. Now is our time to drag Israel into a regional war, to drag America into a regional war, where we can let our proxies loose on, obviously it's a gamble, we can let our proxies loose on our enemies, i.e. Israel and America. And I think Khamenei today led Friday prayers in Tehran, which is a very unusual. He did it in 2012 and he did it in 2020 after Soleimani was killed. And the tone of his speech, if you sort of pass out the stuff that he always talks about, the thing that I thought was really interesting was that, he was talking about Muslim unity across the Ummah. He was saying the people of Palestine, the people of Egypt, the people of Yemen, and basically pitting the Islamic world against the West, i.e., Israel and America. And what he was trying to do there was to build on these existing tensions that are very clear in Gulf states who have allied themselves with Israel, and Bahrain, UAE, Morocco, and to a degree Saudi Arabia. People in these countries are frustrated that their governments aren't doing more to protect Palestinian civilians. And Khamenei was just trying to needle that, trying to probe that sore point for the Gulf states and some Arab states. But ultimately, him framing this in a sort of Islamic world versus the rest, I think that tells you where I think Khamenei, where the hardliners want this conflict to go.
Okay. It does seem. I mean, we're heading a sort of an explosive moment, and I want to pursue that idea, and then I want to look at the possibility of a longer-term conflict, in Lebanon, and how that might carry out. So there are a couple of ways this might go. In the short term, today the Financial Times has a long read on how Israel could go after Iran's nuclear facilities. Just explore that idea, and what do you think the fallout from that might be if they tried to do that?
Yeah, I think so. As Israel's looking at it, it still wants to respond to the missile attack from Tehran a few nights ago, and to my mind, it's got one option, which is to do nothing to Iran, but keep fighting Hezbollah, keep weakening Hezbollah, and eroding Iran's forward defense, as we discussed. I think in Iran, its options are they can enact a proportional strike against IRGC and the self-sufficiency jihad organization, which makes Iran's missiles. They know where all these sites are. They've got very good intelligence on where the missiles are, where the missiles are made. They could enact a proportional response that says it's 1-1 now, and potentially, as the Americans keep on telling them, let's take the win. An attack against IRGC would be something that the Iranians could wear. I think the Iranians could say, fine, you did that, we did this, now let's try and draw a line under it. And obviously the Iranians would move military infrastructure out to minimize losses. I think the second option that Israel has is to hit Iran's critical national infrastructure, so to hit roads, to hit ports, but critically to hit Iran's energy-producing facilities and ports and places where energy products are produced and then shipped out overland towards China and Russia, which is a huge part of Iran's economy at the moment. And Iran is selling oil at a massively discounted price to China. But I mean, that is an indication of Iran's desperation in a time of quite biting sanctions. That, I think, is Israel's second option, and that would carry with it a greater degree of, I think if they did that, that would potentially lead you to think they're softening Iran up for something to come. I think the third, as you've hinted at, the third most inflammatory thing that Iran could do would be to hit Iran's nuclear facilities.
Israel could do.
And the reason that is a huge deal is because this is, when we talk about Iran's forward defense, I think if we talk about their last defense, this is the nuclear option. And nuclear theory in Iran is a really interesting one because lots of Iranians want nuclear power because they see themselves as the regional hegemon, not just militarily, but also intellectually. They hate the idea that Pakistan has a bomb. They hate the idea that Israel has a bomb. And it's not just to keep them safe, it's a sort of intellectual amour propre that Iran has as the way it sees itself. And that's a really important thing to understand. But then Iran is in a very difficult position because this whole idea of breakout time, as in the point at which they tell the world that we have nuclear capability, but we also have the fissile technology to put it in a missile, which means that, because I think if you say we've got nuclear capability, but we don't have a warhead to put it in, it's nothing. But there's a moment, the leaders in Iran know that there is a moment that when you say we have this capability, they look at North Korea, and North Korea is a pariah, and Iran just does not want to be a pariah. And that's a sort of a cultural thing as much as anything else. They can't be this kind of hermetically sealed North Korea of the Middle East because they want to play a role. So I think there is some tension within the decision makers of Iran, even though they probably do have the capability to break out, both in terms of the fissile capability and the sort of nuclear technology required. The point at which they say they've got that, to a degree, they're slightly dead in the water because they know that they've got all these Israeli missiles lined up and ready to go. So I think that far from being a strength, there's a potential weakness attached to Iran saying they have a breakout capability. But notwithstanding that, I think the difficulty that is, I mean, Israel's been wanting to get rid of Iran's nuclear bunkers and silos for donkey's years, but they just haven't been able to, or the time hasn't been right. The challenge they'll face is that a lot of these are built very, very, very far underground, in very compacted bunkers that would be almost impossible to destroy. So I think any attack, and which is why Israel and Mossad have tended towards the symbolic. So Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, who was the head of Iran's sort of warhead and nuclear research facility, was killed. And every time, I mean, Ahmadinejad's regime learnt this the hard way when they would release a picture of him touring a nuclear facility, and probably within 2 years, a lot of those people in that picture had been killed by the Israelis. So that's why Israel's chosen that kind of operation, because they know that it's very difficult to destroy Iran, as it did in Osirak against the Syrian nuclear regime in 2006. And also, the Iranian nuclear program has gone beyond a point at which it can be comprehensively destroyed. So I think. And this is the context for Biden's thoughts the other day, saying, we would not support an attack on Iran's on nuclear facilities. That might be because that was Biden trying to save face, because he knew that it's unlikely that Israel would do that, because they've got options, they've got steps that they can take before they would get there.
I get it. I'd love to take some questions. I don't know if Richard Murphy is still with us. He put a question in very early, and if he is, I'd love him to put that question directly to you, but that may take a few seconds to get up. And if he's not there, I will ask that question to you in just a second. I mean, it's long been said that Israel runs U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. What pressure can, if any, the Americans put on the Israelis to say, look, what are they doing to restrain them?
Yeah, and I mean, at the start of this war, a lot of the talk in the media was about the degree to which Iran could be relied on to rein its proxies in. But I think a feature of this conflict has been America and the UK and Europe's inability to stop Israel from doing what it wants to do. And you have to remember here that when the UK, EU, France, and the US call for a unilateral ceasefire in Lebanon, they're not doing it because they don't like Israel. They're not doing it because they want to see a repeat of October the 7th. They're doing it because they don't think that this is in Israel's interests. A ground war in Lebanon could be ruinous to the region, but it also could be ruinous to Israel. So I think you're seeing an almost total absence of leverage over Israel. And I think you had this sense of, after October the 7th, Biden very pointedly said to Netanyahu, don't let this be your 9/11. Don't let your anger run away with you. And what's happened is that Israel's anger has run away with it. And a friend who's works in Israel and is very well connected said that the problem is Netanyahu's government doesn't want to win 1-0. It wants to win 75,000-0. And potentially,
well, at the moment it's winning 41,000 to 1,000 nil, so 1,000. So
I mean, if we're putting it in
pretty
those
well.
terms. And I think it goes, just last point on that, the tenor of UK and US policymakers pressuring Israel, it's been saying this will not make you safe in the long run, and it will not make us safe in the long run. And if you think that the attack on October the 7th was bad, just you wait till you have Hamas 2.0 and Hezbollah 2.0, the sons of people who've been killed in the bombardment. So, as someone who spent a lot of time in Afghanistan and as a historian, has been a historian, seeing the region from a number of different perspectives, this is a recipe for disaster. This is a recipe for a multi-generational conflict where you will have so many more fighters whose countries are destroyed, who have nothing to live for, and except they nurse this fatal and lethal grievance against the Israeli state that is overexposed on a number of fronts.
Yeah. Okay. A question, more of a point, I think, from Richard Murphy, who's about to go away shortly. So, Richard, get your point in quickly.
Yeah. So I think it fits exactly with that. So with the sort of the mood in Israel about this. I mean, I listened to Times of Israel Daily podcast, and you could feel over the year the shock, the horror, all the different phases, and arguing how to respond. But I'd say over the last week or so, everybody, even the moderates, the people who are looking to find diplomatic solutions, people who any sort of constraint, everyone is just cock a hoop that the pride of the army is back, having been humiliated. But it seems to be even the most moderates think they can bomb their way out of this problem. To picking up exactly what you've just said, that they're stirring up trouble, there seems to be a genuine belief that they can terrify people enough that they will just give up and go away. And it's quite horrifying. There were always extremists, but the most moderates seem to have decided that's what they can do.
And there's a great and Richard, to your point there, there's a
Richard. Let me put that and turn that. Go on.
No, I was going to say I think there's a fascinating book by an Israeli journalist called Ronan Bergen, which is called Rise and Kill First, and it's a history. It's quite a kind of grisly processional history of Mossad's, I suppose, assassinations or lethal strikes, whatever they'd call it, and it takes us from the sort of the early days of going after PLO people and those responsible for the Munichs, right up to Iranian scientists. And I think that to that, even though it details these sort of stunning episodes of operational success and ingenuity, the backdrop to that is a gradually worsening situation in the Middle East. And I think it's to your point that it doesn't, the US found this in Vietnam, we found this in Afghanistan. The more people you kill, that doesn't necessarily equate to a sort of a positive trajectory in peace. You don't get a peace dividend the more you kill, quite the opposite. And Israel's going to find this out. And I think that even though they are undoubtedly in the ascendancy, in exactly the same way that the US and the UK was in the ascendancy in the dying days of 2001 when they'd got rid of the Taliban, that ascendancy will be very, very illusory the more they get stuck into a ground conflict in Lebanon and as the war in Gaza drags on, no matter how debilitated Hamas find themselves and Hezbollah.
We'll take a point from George Muir in just a second, but I just wanted to follow up on at least in the short term, the IDF and Netanyahu said that their overall aim is to get the residents returned to the north, and having a full-scale conflict in Lebanon is probably unlikely to restore that anytime soon.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a point from George Muir. George, go ahead.
Hiya. No, this is. What you've been saying, it's sobering stuff, quite sobering. But just a particular question, turning to sort of motivation and long-term thinking within Tehran, you say that the proxies are their sort of outer defense shield and things like that. And excuse me if I sound naive, what is it that Tehran think that they are? What are the threats against Iran which these proxies are protecting them from? Do they feel, I remember, clearly Iraq attacked Iran, but do they in fact feel threatened? What is the threat which they wish to be protected against?
I think that's a great question, and I've always there's a very funny image that sometimes does the rounds, and it's a map of the Middle East, and it's with lots of dots of US bases on it. And the sort of the text underneath, it says, how inconvenient of the Iranians to put their country so near to all of America's bases. I mean, that's a sort of a humorous aside, but you put your finger on it when you say that Iraq attacked Iran in the 1980s. And I think what people forget, I think the headline-grabbing conflict that Iran has today is with Israel. But the reality is that Iran still suffers. The Islamic Republic was forged in that conflict with Iraq. And what happened in that conflict with Iraq? The whole world sided with Saddam Hussein, provided Saddam with intelligence, provided Saddam with weapons and assistance where necessary. And Iran was totally isolated, totally on its own, and it had to resort to buying weapons from the Israelis. So that's the kind of origin story of the Islamic Republic's regional paranoia. And all it really worries about, its biggest fear is a united Iraq threatening Iran. And if you look at 2001 to now, prior to 9/11, Iran had an adversary on the Afghan side, on its eastern border with the Taliban, and Iran and the Taliban very nearly came to blows, came to a conflict in the late 1990s when the Taliban killed some Iranian diplomats in Mazar. And then on the other side, you had a Saddam Hussein. So actually, the American operations in 2001 and 2003 got rid of their two biggest allies. And ever since then, Iran has been working to divide Iraq so that Iraq can never pose a problem to it, and to divide Afghanistan so that Afghanistan, and weaken Afghanistan so that Afghanistan can never pose a problem to it. So it fears a strong, united Iraq. It fears a strong, united Afghanistan, and obviously it fears America. But I think that what drives Iranian thinking is that experience of the Iran-Iraq war when the whole world ganged up on it. And when you listen to Khamenei talk, when he talks about, for example, the Masa Amini protests that happened in Iran, they've been sort of going on, rumbling on in the last couple of years in Iran. He sees that as outside interference, people creating homegrown, or people creating opposition movements within Iran. So this paranoia that the whole world is out to get him, it started in the Iraq War, and obviously there are further antecedents in the way Iran sees the world, and that can go into Shia ideology. It can go into the way Iran sees itself, further back into history. But the short term, Iran is terrified of a repeat of that experience where the whole world gangs up on it, and that's why I think you have. And where Iran was sanctioned hugely, its weapons industry was sanctioned massively. And that's why, when I mentioned earlier, its sort of semi-secret, or it's not a secret anymore, missile capability is called the Self-Sufficiency Jihad Organization. And that really always struck a chord with me, because it tells you everything you need to know about the way Iran sees defense and sees its regional history since 1979.
And it can't compete with the United States. It can't compete with Israel in terms of sort of conventional weapons and armies, but it can do a very good job of providing small weapons to insurgents and having a relatively cheap missile program. So that's the defense mechanism. Maureen O'Mara says, could you ask this for me? Where are the Saudis in all of this?
Yeah, I mean, really good. I mean, you mentioned the FT. The Saudi foreign minister wrote a very impassioned leader in the FT yesterday, saying, calling on a negotiated ceasefire in Lebanon, calling on a two-state solution, very, very loudly calling for a Palestinian state, a stop to West Bank incursions and settlements. And I think that was, if you look at prior to October the 7th, Saudi and the relative withdrawal of America from the Middle East, Saudi Arabia was being positioned as the sort of diplomatic policeman of the region, looking to take a bigger role, normalizing ties with the Iranians, normalizing ties with Saudi Arabia. I think you're right. Saudi Arabia has been quite on the back foot up until now. I mean, that's to a degree related to MBS's nervousness around getting dragged into a conflict. I mean, they have obviously an ongoing conflict in Yemen with the Houthis, and they have obviously threats from the southern border. And MBS's big priority is Vision 2030. MBS's big priority is turning Saudi Arabia into this economic powerhouse and modernizing Saudi Arabia. So a lot of attention is taken from there, away from the Middle East because of this. But I think I was speaking to a Saudi friend yesterday. Saudi Arabia would like to be more involved diplomatically, and particularly some of the conversations are, what role can Saudi Arabia play in the rebuilding of Gaza? Because someone's going to need to foot the bill for this. And I think that a prominent Saudi role in the rebuilding of Gaza, with all the money that they've got, and obviously they're having some financial wobbles, but they would still be in a position to be able to rebuild. But I think Saudi's in a difficult position because it wants potentially to normalize ties with Israel, because it sees benefits in that in terms of defense technology. And it also is potentially keen to normalize ties with Iran because it sees a peace dividend there. And a peace dividend is good for Vision 2030. It's good for stability. It's good for MBS. So I think that they have been treading a cautious line, but now I think they're seeking to be a bit more assertive diplomatically. And I think their role in rebuilding Gaza would be a very positive one.
How much has the death toll in Gaza affected Arab regimes who have an alliance with Israel? I mean, 41,000 dead. It seems the West, we're completely hypocritical when it comes to the bombings of hospitals and schools in one nation, in one area, Gaza, and then comparing it with another, Ukraine. So I'm just wondering how that affects, it doesn't seem to affect Western governments in any way whatsoever. They're quite happy to sort of turn a blind eye to it. Does it affect Arab governments?
Yeah, I just want to echo that the hypocrisy is quite stunning, and I think that that's not to say that we aren't right to criticize Putin and what he's doing in Ukraine, because it is horrendous, but I think it's a very difficult position given our long-standing relationship with Israel, but it's been quite dispiriting to watch the powerlessness of Western governments over when it comes to Israel, and the sort of spinelessness that goes with it. And I've got obviously former colleagues who are based in Israel, and it's just a very difficult conversation. I think Arab governments, the Ibrahim Accords, which was the normalization, the sort of Kushner-led normalization between Israel and a number of Arab states, that is still standing. And diplomatically, it's still a thing because those countries are keen for Israeli technology and Israeli investment. So, and obviously they share an antipathy with Iran. The challenge is you look at, there is the potential, and again, speaking to some people in Saudi Arabia, this is a feature. What it will do is it might not affect the Ibrahim Accords, it might not affect the governments in those countries and their desire to have stronger relationship with Israel, but it definitely runs the risk of radicalizing a generation of Arab youth. And you have seen throughout North Africa and throughout the Arab world quite strident opposition to the governments, and quite strident and unwavering and unabashed support for the Palestinian cause. And that is a tension that I think will worry a lot of leaders in this country. Take, for example, Morocco. Big movement of young Moroccan people who support Gaza and who support Palestine and are very pro what Iran is doing. And again, these are the tensions that Khamenei was trying to draw out in his Friday sermon today, speaking to those young people of Bahrain, of Morocco, who are horrified, as a lot of people are, with what Israel is doing to innocent Palestinians. And shining a light in a very Iranian way on that disconnect between the leadership of a country, its diplomatic alliances, and the people who say enough is enough. This is absolutely horrendous. So that is a looming tension. And for now, the Ibrahim Accords still stand. But I think that the longer this war goes on, the more pressure you're going to see from people within those countries putting on governments, say we can't countenance a relationship with Israel.
Okay, well, Marty, Ryan's got a good follow-up question on this one, which is really more about Iran internally. Go ahead, Marty.
Yes, when you were talking about the threats to Iran and what's motivating them, I couldn't help but think about the internal resistance to the regime that's been happening in Iran for a while, with the women taking off the hijab, and women being killed, etc. And I was wondering how that might be impacting Iran's current concerns about their position in the Middle East.
Yeah, I think that goes to the heart of Iran's desire to potentially to not get itself into a regular exchange of missiles with Israel. Iran knows that it doesn't enjoy overwhelming popular support. It knows that any violence or any kind of missile strikes on Iran will likely lead to people pointing the finger at the Islamic Republic. And that's been a feature of, one of the features of Khamenei's support and the Islamic Republic's support for Palestine and for Lebanon is you've got a lot of Iranian people saying, why are we supporting this issue in Palestine when I'm a civil servant and I haven't been paid for 6 months? Why are we supporting these people? Why are we spending billions of dollars to Gaza, to Lebanon, to the Houthis, when our country is in an absolute mess internally? And some of the Iranian slogans are always a really good indicator of where popular opinion is. And a slogan which basically sort of says that, why do we care about Palestine? We care about Iran. That's been a feature of popular protests in Iran for the last at least 15 years. And the Islamic Republic knows that it doesn't enjoy the sort of internal cohesion to prosecute a war. It's not like the Iran-Iraq war, where the revolution was young, people were broadly supportive of what the revolution had achieved and what it had got rid of or what it had replaced. The Islamic Republic knows that it's not stable enough to prosecute a war or to invite a war upon it, and that's where you've got that, even within the hardliners wanting not to tip over into a regional conflict, and that's the tension. And I think the Massa Amini movement, it exists still. The Islamic Republic have been very, very, very good at quelling it through violence, sheer violence and oppression. But they know that it's always there, and they know that it wouldn't take much to kick it off again. So that is a key part of their decision making.
Peter Sullivan's got a good and amusing question, to which I will add my own in a second. Peter, go ahead. Peter, you need to open your microphone. Peter is in Johannesburg. Peter. So if he doesn't open his microphone, I'll ask it for him. He says, a fairly respected commentator said the movie Top Gun Maverick is obviously, quotes, a rehearsal for an attack on Iran's nuclear facility. Would you agree? That's a sort of a jokey question, but with it goes the thought that the Israeli coalition, Netanyahu's coalition, is glued together by continued the conflict. It has managed to sustain his coalition, quite well, and you could see that a longer term, he may feel that he has the ability to sustain a conflict with Iran.
Yeah, and I was going to say earlier is that so I haven't seen the film Top Gun Maverick. I'm told it's very good, and I will put it on my list. But I think Netanyahu's career has been defined by his antipathy towards Iran in regionally. The number of speeches he's done at the UN General Assembly where he's holding up a ticking time bomb, or the press conferences he's done when he parades in front of secret Iranian nuclear documents that Mossad stole from a Tehran warehouse. He has defined himself as the thing that stands between the world and a nuclear armed Iran. So it's in the hubris of war, in that sort of in whatever it is that he and his war cabinet are obviously caught up in, it's fairly logical to think that they would seek to expand things into Iran. So I wouldn't be surprised if there were more attacks on Iran. In fact, that's absolutely likely, and it's part of this sort of perpetual motion thing that. If you keep expanding, you sort of, it's a bit like a company that just keeps raising money. It doesn't really have to worry about the bottom line. And I think in the war that Netanyahu's trying to fight, and also he knows that if he expands into Iran, the Americans can't leave him out to dry. They have to get involved in that. So he feels, and also he's also got 6 months where he knows that America is a lame duck. No one's really making any big shifts in policy in America between now and January. So he's using this time to pursue his own agenda, which is to strike at Iran. And from my time in government, I remember Israel was chomping at the bit to bomb Iran's nuclear facilities. So that's definitely uppermost in his mind. And again, I'll go back to the speech he made on Twitter, where he appeared to be speaking directly to the Iranian people. And I think it's important to say that no one in Iran is buying that.
Peter, any thoughts? Now your microphone is open.
I know that journalists hate being asked to look into crystal balls, but I would like to know where you think we will be in a year's time. Now, politicians will always give you an answer to that question, but journalists are a little bit smarter, I think. But I'd like you to give me an idea of where you think we will be in a year's time.
My worry is that this will become another forever war. And if you look at the 1982 incursion that Israel made into Lebanon, it lasted until the year 2000. That's the concern is that what we've seen, this conflict has been defined diplomatically by an inability to reach a diplomatic solution. And whilst every day that you can't reach a diplomatic solution is another day that the fighting can increase. And as I've said before, as the fighting increases, so counterintuitively, the risk to Israel increases. And therefore, that drives the logic that they need to keep fighting. So I don't see an end to fighting anytime soon. And perhaps it's very depressing to say that the best case scenario is that you just continue this forever war, because the alternative is a regional war, which is horrific for everyone. And I think the only nation that would benefit from a regional war would, ironically or bizarrely, be Russia, because if you look at if a regional war would drive refugees into Europe, a regional war would mean that every dollar is spent from America on that regional war is a dollar that couldn't be spent in Ukraine. A regional war would allow Putin to make more gains into Ukraine. And also, as more refugees come to Europe, that's sort of food for the far right in Europe, which, again, we all know that Putin is propping up the far right in Europe and seeking its expansion because it sees that as a Trojan horse to undermine European cohesion and undermine the EU and potentially NATO. So a continuation of a forever war in the absence of a diplomatic solution, I think, is ironic. It was very sadly, I think, the best case scenario, because you either have forever war or you have all-out war, forever war in a sort of localized Lebanon and Gaza way. But I can't see what you would need to have a grand diplomatic breakthrough. I just think that as the war continues to sort of expand and go on, you lessen the chances of a diplomatic breakthrough. And I suppose, I'm often asked, how close are we to a war? And I often turn that question on its head and say, it doesn't matter how close we are to a war. What matters is how far we are away from peace. And I think we're moving inexorably further away from the possibility of there being any negotiated settlement here.
I think that's where we're going to leave it, everyone. It's a pretty grim and worrying note. And sitting here in the UK, it's very worrying to see our own government drawn into this conflict, and the US apparently powerless to stop it as well. Charlie Gammell, thank you very much indeed for your time. I hope we can have you back on soon.
Yeah, lovely to be here, Nicholas, and thank you for the questions.